Hey folks, today I'm going to talk about domain integrity. I'm not going to try and cover everything about domain integrity today. We're going to cover not null and default constraints, and we'll spend another day on unique and probably 2 days covering check constraints. We might spend uh, it's also possible we might spend unique we might cover unique and the first part of check constraints on one day, and then the second part on another day. So altogether, I'm thinking it might take I'm hoping it can cut this down to maybe 3 lectures. It might take 4. Some people tend to have problems running problems doing the domain integrity. That's what I've noticed. I also feel like the quickest way to learn how to do this is to just use the code samples. And again, like I keep saying it, plug and chug. So you take the syntax, you fill in the syntax. Don't think too much about what it means. The names, what it means is in the name. Not null means what? Something cannot be null. It cannot be blank. Default. When do we give something a default? It's a default value. Unique. Well, nothing is the same when it's unique. Check might be a little bit confusing, but we'll talk about that. But why am I pointing this out? The constraints are kind of in the name, and what they mean is in the name. We don't need to make that complicated. We don't need to make writing them complicated. Okay? This stuff I think should be fairly mechanical and straightforward. If you're not sure how to do things, look at the notes. If the notes are not clear, man, maybe look at an example of how it's done. I also think it's very important to learn this, to not spend a lot of time reading, but to spend a lot of time doing. And there's examples. Use examples. If you don't like examples and notes, look at the examples on Microsoft's website. I like the examples on Microsoft's website about Transact SQL or Azure SQL because that's what we're using. You could also look at what's in W3C schools. Why am I saying all of this? I've noticed that people get bogged down. I feel like people shouldn't get bogged down, and it's fairly straightforward. All right? So, with all of that being said, let's start talking about what domain integrity is. So, remember, a domain is a set of all possible values in a column. And so how do we maintain the domain's integrity? Okay. Well, we use a number of there's 4 constraints that we use. And while some people will also include the data type, I would actually like to include the data type. But most people are not going to think of a data type as a constraint. And so there's 4 of them, 4 others. And then they are not null, default, unique, and check. So we've already seen some of the methods for adding constraints. We can add all of the constraints. We add all of the constraints either when a table is being defined initially, when the column is being added or altered, or when a constraint is being added by itself to a table. Not null, there isn't a separate way to add not null. Okay? The only way you can add not null is this way and this way. So we add not null to when we're either adding or altering a column. That's the only time you can do not null. Okay? Um, you can also add multiple constraints at the same time. Uh, but I like to use add constraints separately. I think it makes it more readable, and you can do them all in a group. So I might do all the defaults together, all the uniques and checks together. I think it's more readable. Okay. And it also helps people do error checking. So remember, so how do we add a constraint when a table is defined? We've seen this before, right? When we're declaring a column, we say column name, data type, optional parameter. Most of the optional parameters are going to be not null, um, or some other constraint, maybe identity. So the most common optional parameter is going to be a constraint type. So if you look here, this is an example of a table, and then you can see they're doing it in more fully as a data type. There's a constraint keyword, constraint name, the type, and then the constraint definition. And one reason why I don't like to do this is it can become very difficult to read. If you are going to do it this way, you should probably use indents. And so if you look, what constraint type, what are the values it can be? Primary key, foreign key, unique, default, or check. You cannot use not null. All right. So I've talked about constraints in general. Let's talk a bit more specifically about not null. So what does a not null constraint do? By default, what do I mean by default? If most of the time when we're creating a table and we're defining its columns, the default is what's put there by when you don't say anything, right? So the default is columns are allowed to be blank. They're allowed to have null values. How do you know this? If I go into the table, let's look at this table. So if I go over to this table again, right? And I go, well, if I look at this, this might give you an idea. It's maybe not the best example because I already did some things, but if I go create to, where is it? Oh, script table as creates to new query editor. You see it says not null, right? That's a default. It says things are not null. Oh, sorry, it says things are null, right? There's a couple of things I said not null. And how do you know this? If you see these, it says I didn't put anything, and it just assumes that they're going to be null. That's why I say the default is null, right? Um, okay, so I feel like and that's telling us something. The fact that the default for most columns is null, it's telling us that we don't, most of our columns, we should allow them to be blank. There's only a few that we do not want null values. All right. One of the few is going to, and those few will probably be at least one of those columns that we say is not null should have a primary key constraint imposed on it. All right. Um, and How do we say it's not null? It's very simple. You see an example over here. We just write what? Not null. All right. I think that covers it. You see examples over here. Okay. And recall that we don't, and there's another example over here where we're using what? Alter table, right? And we're saying not null. Okay. That's all that we need to know about null. And again, it can only be set. This is kind of important. Unlike other constraint, not null can only be set when the column is being declared along with its data type. When do we declare a column along with its data type? When we're defining a table, altering a table, altering a column that's in a table, or adding a new column, right? And there's a note here that's giving people an idea of when you should say a column is not null. When you can guarantee the value will be present. Okay, if I'm making a table of people, right? Maybe I might want to say people have an address and maybe the first thing I need for everybody is probably a first name and a last name. Okay. I might need a mailing address. Okay. But I need at least one contact. Maybe I need an email. If I'm on a website, okay, I need probably an email. I need maybe a first name or a last name and a username. I don't need something like a street address. If you're an employer, what do you need from the new employees? You must have a first name, last name. You need a mailing address of some sort, right? You need a social security number. You probably need a birth date. There's some things that you don't need. Things that you don't need, maybe you allow those to be blank. Okay? If you cannot guarantee that you will get that information, or you really need that information to process a transaction, you can say not null. Anything that's optional or that you have no control over. For example, hospitals, not everyone who comes to a hospital is going to have a social security number, right? So you probably say, you probably allow that to be blank. Not everyone is going to have an insurance card, so you allow it to be blank. Okay? If you're a grocery store, you don't need to keep track of. Not everyone is going to use a credit card. Some people might use cash. So you don't need to say that for each transaction, you don't need to record it, a payment type. You should allow, the way you could do it, the way I would do it is I would have probably a payment type field, and then you'd allow credit card, cash, check, or something like that. Does that make sense? The other way you could do it is you could say that, anyway, you get I hope it makes sense now. Things that you must have and that you can guarantee will be present, you say it should be not null. Things that you don't really need, that you cannot always guarantee that you will be given that value, you allow it to be blank. That's it. Okay. And you've seen examples. Now let's talk about default constraints. Well, over here there's an example of an anonymous offers. What's a default constraint used for? Generally, you have a default value. I think it says it in the word. maybe like if you're going to a hospital, what's the default name for a patient? It's going to be something like, I prefer the name, it's going to be John or Jane Doe, right? I prefer something that's gender neutral. I can't think of anything right now, but you have some name. That's a default name. In a dollar store, what's going to be the default price for everything? We would say maybe $1.99 after we take into account for inflation. You almost can't really find anything that's a dollar anymore, right? So that's going to be the default price. Um, you might set the default um, height, or you might maybe in a work environment you might set this is the default office size, or the default number of people can be in a cubicle. So what's the default? We just use that all the time. Some of you, when you're making a new user who sysadmins, what will they do? Some of them might have a default initial password that must be changed, right? So I think everyone gets an idea what the default is, and we can set those. Now, a lot of the time when we're using a default value, we're going to pair default with not null. All right. It's not a good idea to pair default with unique, because if you use a default more than once, it's not going to be unique, right? There's one case where we might pair default, not null, and unique, and that's when we're trying to generate, when we're using sequential IDs or group UIDs, and I'll have a separate lecture on that. Okay, so you can see over here, the way we do default is constraint name, the keyword is default, value for column name. Okay, and what I like to use for the default column names is either this column name underscore df, or better yet, because sometimes you might have multiple tables with the same name, especially this is one of the reasons we like to use schemas, is table name, column name, underscore df. Now you might have, it's very likely maybe you have a customers table, you have a people table. All of these tables are going to have what? Probably an ID column. If I say ID underscore df, or name underscore df, or price underscore df, it's not clear what table it belongs to. But if I say retail price, let me write SQL code, and that will make it clearer. So if I go here and I go query, let's say I want to declare these default constraints. I do alter table invoice customers, right? And I do add. Well, I'll change it this way. Yeah, Control Z. And add constraint price df default, let's say $2.99 for price. Okay, and have another table, another invoice, but this is for what? Maybe this is, I have my bill to what? Consultants. Oh, well, this is a little bit. Okay, let me say bill and wholesalers. So now this is maybe wholesalers, it might be 0 dot, right? With this, you can't tell why, you know that SQL can tell what which table it applies to because they are in different schemas. But someone who's reading this, they won't know right away. So if I say wholesaler, oops, price, or I say wholesale price, and this I say customer price. It now becomes very clear. Oh, this is a custom. Someone who's playing with this will. Oh, this is the customer price in the customer table. This is a wholesaler price. This is for the price column in the wholesalers table. Does that make sense? So that's why I think this style is a better one. Okay, and you can see some examples over here. I gave you an example right here of how we can use the default to alter a column. Okay, and this is also giving. So now I'm going to go back, and you see other examples here, right? And if you look at this, you see for numbers, there's no quotes. Let me give you an example where let's go, and I'm going to go to alter table customer dot liaisons, add constraint first name. Let me write it like this: liaison first name, df default Joe for first name, right? So you see, this is how you set it for things that have to be in quotes. What tends to be in single quotes? The text data types and date time. Anything else, it's not going to be in quotes. So you've seen an example here of how, what are we noticing? It's always the same. After constraint, we say the data type, the constraint name, the type of constraint. And you see how this differs from what we saw for primary key. Okay. So now let's look at how we can add a default constraint to an existing table. As an example over here, you can see that they use, in this example, what you can see that the constraint is really long. When you're doing it like this, we don't say use a for. All right. There's another example here. You see they don't use the for. So let me go back and we'll see what I'm referring to. So if we go to custom installation scripts, we've seen the primary key over here. I'm going to also set primary key. Let me give this a name. So I'll say this is liaison underscore PK. And you see if I do it like this, I have to say what? Constraint. And now when I like to do it like this. So you see there isn't the comma comes over here. And let me set and I'm going to change this. So we've seen that over here. And what I'm going to also do, I'm going to change this to, I'll change this later to using GUID. So we can see another way we can use default. So I put a primary key constraint and I'm also going to give it, since this is not null, right? I can't have a default here. Let me give the default, what could I have for a default? I'm going to set, I'm going to set the default first name. So I'll do like this. I'll say not null. And I'll say constraint. Let me say liaison first name underscore df default Joe. Oops. What am I doing wrong? Let's see. Maybe I'm missing a comma somewhere. Oh. It happens to be, oh, it's an M. Okay, there. So you see how I've set that? I don't say for. Let me do another one. And what happens if I do actually put for? So I'll go Control C. Control V. And it doesn't like that, so I'll change this liaison. Let me change this, fix that error. Change this to liaison lost. For which default value I save for. So for last name, you see it doesn't, actually it does like it. And that didn't work under old versions of SQL from what I recall. But you see it seems to like that. And how can we make sure we can run this, can't we? So I also say what? Not null. So why do I have a default value? Because these cannot be null, right? So let's run this. Now, the place that might be useful to have a default is for the phone. And I'm going to put one over here. And I'll put this on a separate line. Here I put comma, and I'll go Control C, Control V, liaison phone. And I'll set none for. So let's leave it like this. How many default constraints can I have? So if I run this, execute, so you see it doesn't like that, does it? So if I remove this, what happens? I execute. See, it tells me line 42, right? Which is here. So I take this away. Let me change this. Yeah, I change this. I take that away. Oh, I think I have a, sorry. So you see it's about constraint name default. So you see it doesn't like that. Oh, I see what the problem is. That a comma. And I'll try putting this back so we can see. So you see it tells me line 39, there's an error. If I take this away, and run it again, see it doesn't like the 4. Constraint, liaison, none. What am I doing wrong here? So you see it doesn't like that, does it? I'm going to take this part out, Control X. Say not null, right? And I'll paste this here, Control V, and I'll take this, Control C, Control V, and I'll change this to alter. Add. And like to write it this way. Let's see what happens this time. So I'll highlight this, execute. See, it works fine, right? And if I now run this, what happens? Is there an error? Let's see. No errors. That's one of the reasons why I like to define not nulls outside. If you do it this way, you can kind of see that this should apply. The name tells us it applies to this column. But when there's a lot of these, it can be a little bit difficult to read. So I feel like this way is more readable. And if we refresh this table, so I'll refresh that. Refresh. And we see the columns. We don't see a primary key. Yeah, we see a primary key. We see not null. We see last name is not null now. If I go to keys, we see it as just a primary key. Now let's look at the constraints. We see there's all of these constraints. And the constraint name, you can see underscore df tells me it's a default constraint. And I script constraint as, see it puts braces. You can see how it's written. All right. And even if, another reason why I like to find a constraint separately, let me see if I go and do script table as create to new query editor window. Another reason why I like to do all of these separately is when we look at how SQL does it, what does it do first? It creates a table, right? You can see all of that in here. It sets a primary key, and it did all of these outside. Okay, so that's another reason why I like to define most of my constraints separately from the create table. So close that, and now I have this over here. And I use indenting to make things more readable. You can see I find that this is now very busy and harder to read. And what I'm going to do next, so this is the way people will sometimes do it. I don't like to do it that way. I'm going to take these lines out, Control X, and now if I do it like this, Control V, Control X, Control V, and I will tab, and I'll take that away. For first name. Now also remember, I can only set a constraint on a column that exists. If it doesn't exist, I can't set a constraint for it. Missing a keyword for. Right. So now you see all of these. I like to do it this way. What's the point of doing it that way? That I think it's somewhat easier to read. The disadvantage is if you run this and there's an error, the whole thing fails. So when you're starting out, some people might like to, you might instead of doing this all as a batch, you might have a single alter table for each one. So it's easy to see where it fails. And I'll do an example. So I'll do another example like that. In a minute. So, but before I do that, is there anything else you need to talk about for default constraints? So, you see over here, what do they talk about? Pairing default and not null constraints. Why would we do that? Generally, you might want when there's a value that we want to have repeated in case as a placeholder, we might use not null in default. And they said over here, if it's required, if it's to never have nulls and we don't use keys, we should have given a default value. So if you look at this code sample, they have what? A dollar store. And if you've been to a dollar store, it can get very busy. The way they make your money in a dollar store is by cutting down on overhead. How do you cut down overhead? You have very little stuff. You don't pay them very well. So people might not get to things in time. It might be a little bit chaotic. So what do you want to do? You might just keep track of how many things you have. Well, I don't think it's ideal, but you might say, give every item a name, mark it as unknown. You can set the price, and then you just set a default price, right? You see over here, we've set the default price at $1.99. Okay, so you're saying not null default. The barcode we might want that to be unique. We might want to use that as a primary key. So you can see, look at that over here. Okay, now the other way we might pass, there's an example over here where we talk about sequence objects. I happen to prefer using sequence objects for generating my surrogate IDs. I don't like to use identity because you've seen that identity you have to, an identity property is set for the table and it can be a little bit hard to work with. The sequence object, it's a bit more flexible, okay? And so I can make all of my sequence objects and do some things that are a bit more, it's nicer to work with. So I won't talk about that today, but generally what you can use is I can create a sequence object, I create a sequence, and if you look at this code fragment, what do you see? You create a sequence, you give it a name, you tell it what number to start with, what to increment by, you can have a min and max value and a cache size. And there's examples over here. Most of the time, why do I like to use a sequence object? I could just have a schema of all my sequences, and I can assign them to whatever table, whatever column. So you see an example here. I'm creating that. And then after I've created a sequence, what do? I add a constraint on the surrogate ID and I use a default next value for sequence. Okay. And that's a sequence name on the column. So I'll do that. We won't be really using that in this class, but that's an example. And so that's all we need to talk about for not null and default constraints.